The radio was still crackling when my flashlight beam cut through the tall grass along Route 41. On the shoulder, a silver sedan without plates, coated in dust and broken promises. The smell of rust and something older, sweeter, rotten, leaked through the cracks. Abandoned vehicle, the dispatch had said. Routine. I placed my hand on the cold metal, took a breath, and pulled the trunk latch. The black plastic gave way with a tense snap. Inside, a curled-up body, bones the years had tried to hide. And then I saw it. The St. Michael pendant, scratched with a number I knew better than my own. His badge number. Nathan Cole, my partner, my personal ghost for 10 years. The world shrank to the size of that trunk. The past came back with the hum of the power lines and the distant grind of a train. My throat closed. I had promised his family I would find what was left of him. I found it. But in the glove compartment, an envelope with my name, and inside, a Polaroid of that same car, taken earlier today at sunset, with a shadow standing behind me and a message scrawled in ink. You were too late again. I was born in a small town in Tennessee, where the streets ended in fields and the nights were marked by the distant sound of trains cutting through the dark. My father was the sheriff, my mother a nurse. I grew up with the smell of burnt coffee in police stations and the exhaustion carved into her face after long shifts. Early on, I understood that life wasn't made of happy endings, but of survival, hard choices and scars that don't show. I learned to shoot before I could drive, learned to read a lie in a man's eyes before I understood what love was. I grew up believing that protecting others was the only way to give my own existence meaning, as if carrying the world's weight could somehow lighten my own demons. When I joined the force, still young, I carried a naive ambition to be a hero, to fix what time and violence had broken. But the badge quickly taught me that heroes don't exist, only tired men with weary eyes, doing the best they can with what little they have. That's when I met Nathan Cole, the partner fate would tear from me a decade later. He was the lighter half of our duo, the guy who could crack a joke at a crime scene, who always believed there was still some good left in people. I was the opposite, cynical, shaped by cold reports, by bodies zipped into black bags, by promises no one ever kept. He used to laugh at my seriousness, telling me I'd grow old too fast if I didn't learn to see the other side. Maybe he was right. As the years passed, I became a respected cop, but never a loved one. My superiors saw a man who delivered results, someone willing to crawl into the darkest alleys and coldest cases without hesitation. My colleagues saw me as distant, unreachable, a man with little space left for bombs. Off duty, my world was empty. I never married, never built a family. My life was shifts that blurred into each other, endless. Reports and a bottle of bourbon that kept me company until dawn. I wasn't living. I was serving an invisible sentence that never seemed to end. Nathan's disappearance was the blow that broke me. It was a case that should never have gone cold. But the city moved on. The precinct stacked new files on top, and time erased the traces. Only I stayed trapped in that day, replaying every detail, every misread clue, every chance I missed. I became obsessed, digging through evidence boxes, questioning old informants, chasing trails that ended in dead ends. Nathan was more than a partner. He was living proof that there was still decency in the world, and losing him ripped away what little hope I had left. When the case was shelved, it felt like they weren't just burying him, but burying me along with him. Since then, every call, every case, carried an echo of what I hadn't solved. Every mugshot reminded me of the killer still free, of the fate I couldn't change. I walked the line between law and obsession, willing to push further than I should for answers. Some called me dedicated, others dangerous. I knew only this. I couldn't escape the promise I made to Nathan's family, with their folded flag still warm in my hands. I will find him, no matter the cost. 10 years later, when I opened the trunk of that abandoned car, I didn't just find bones. I found my own life, condensed into failures and scars, There was the proof that I had never moved on, that my identity had been forged in absence. I am a cop, yes. But before that, I am a broken man, chained to a vow that consumed me whole. And now, standing over his body, I know the story isn't over. On the contrary, someone has been watching me all these years, someone who knew where to bury the past and exactly when to dig it up. And that shadow won't stop until it destroys me completely. It was a slow afternoon on shift, one of those days when the radio spends more time silent than speaking, when the static finally cracked with a flat, almost indifferent voice. "Abandoned vehicle on Route 41 near mile marker 12. Check it out." I'd heard that kind of call dozens of times before, almost always ending in nothing. A drunk who left his car on the shoulder or someone too broke to call a tow. But that day, for reasons I couldn't explain, the sound of those words cut through me like an omen. Maybe it was the silence that followed, or maybe the faint tremor in the dispatcher's voice, like she'd caught something in the details she couldn't put into words. I flicked on the siren, low, more to keep myself company on the road than to warn anyone. The sun was sagging toward the horizon, painting the sky orange and red, like fresh blood spilled across a movie screen. The cracked asphalt stretched out ahead of me, swallowing every mile, and the closer I got to the coordinates, the heavier the air grew. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just an abandoned car. It was something waiting for me, a message written by Fate in invisible ink. Dispatch repeated the location, adding, "Caller was a trucker. Said the vehicle's been sitting there since morning, no movement. Doors look shut. No one around." A banal detail, barely worth noting. But my instincts flared. Truckers don't call things in for nothing. If he picked up the phone, it's because something about that car gnawed at him. Something that didn't fit even in the lonely logic of the highway. I drove in silence, one hand locked on the wheel, eyes fixed. On the rear view longer than I should. Nobody was following me, and still I felt it. Every set of headlights in the distance looked like eyes watching me. Every shadow cast by the poles felt like someone pacing just out of reach. The clicking of my blinker marked time with my breath, each tick like a countdown to something I couldn't yet name. As the miles closed, memories bled into the present. The last time I saw Nathan, that wink before he stepped into an op that swallowed him whole, the dead. Air on the radio after we lost contact. My mind loved to play that trick on me, slipping the past into the present, reminding me that ghosts don't sleep. But it wasn't weakness. It was radar. My body knew what my mind resisted. The storm was about to break. The call was simple, but deep down, I knew the truth. Nothing would be simple about that night. I touched the badge on my chest like it was a charm and reminded myself of what I had left. Debts to ghosts, a promise unfulfilled, and an emptiness that no solved case had ever managed to fill. The radio hissed again. "Unit 27, confirm arrival at location." I drew in a breath, the kind you take before diving into icy water, and forced my voice steady as I answered. But inside, I knew I wasn't rolling up on just an abandoned car. I was about to pry open a door time had locked a decade ago. And when you knock on the past, you better be ready, because it doesn't just answer, it comes for you. The engine rumbled heavy as I pulled onto the shoulder. The wind carried the metallic tang of night closing in, mixed with the faint stench of burnt oil. And in that moment, before I even stepped out of the cruiser, I already knew. This wasn't routine. This wasn't coincidence. That car wasn't waiting for just anyone. It was waiting for me. The shoulder looked swallowed by weeds, as if the highway itself had tried to forget that stretch of asphalt. I pulled the cruiser a few yards back from the sedan and just watched for a moment. The car sat there, motionless, blending into the scenery, but there was something in the way the fading sunlight clung to its bodywork that unsettled me. It didn't look abandoned. It looked like it was waiting. The windows were filmed over with dust, etched by wind and time. The front bumper was scarred with rust like old wounds. And still, one detail made me narrow my eyes. The tires. Worn, yes, but not flat. Not the way you'd expect from a car forgotten for months, maybe years. It looked staged, recently left, dressed up to look old. I stepped out of the cruiser, and silence rushed in immediately. Even the insects seemed to hold their breath, as if they were watching too. The air was heavy, humid, laced with the smell of trampled grass and the faint burn of diesel drifting from trucks far down the interstate. And then I caught it. Another odor. Subtle, but unmistakable. Sweet, rancid, the quiet announcement of death. Cops and hunters know it instantly. It clings to your throat, like tar. I circled the car slowly. The silver paint was streaked, as though it had been washed hastily with dirty water. The door handles showed no scratches, no forced entry. I pressed my hand to the driver's side door, cold, unnaturally cold for a vehicle that had supposedly been sitting under the sun all day. A chill ran down my spine. It didn't make sense. At the hood, I bent closer. The dust had been disturbed, dragged sideways as if someone's hands had pressed down on it not long ago. Caught in the metal's edge was a sliver of something small, too small to notice at first. A fragment of a fingernail. I froze, the weight of that tiny detail ringing louder than any alarm. The windows were smeared, darkened, yet I couldn't shake the sense of eyes staring back from inside. I rapped my knuckles against the glass. The sound came back dull, muffled, wrong, not the echo of an empty car. My pulse jumped. This wasn't an abandoned vehicle. It was a sealed chamber, a secret, locked tight. I remembered the trucker's words. Doors looked shut. He hadn't said a thing about the trunk. My lungs felt tight, my muscles rigid, as if every nerve already knew what waited inches away. That instinct, that cop's sixth sense, was screaming. I raised my flashlight, even though the last streaks of sunlight still clung to the horizon. The beam carved through the grime on the glass, catching torn upholstery, stains that might have been rust, or something else. My movements stayed deliberate, controlled, but my heart was pounding like a warning siren in my chest. And then I saw it, stuck to the inside of the windshield, faded and almost invisible, a parking sticker from downtown, a garage where Nathan and I had worked cases years ago. My stomach twisted. This wasn't random. This wasn't just a car forgotten by chance. It had come from the archives of my own past, dragged here for me to find. I stood still for a long second, caught between stepping back and stepping further in. I knew that if I opened that trunk, I wouldn't just find evidence of a crime. I'd find the missing piece of myself I'd been chasing for 10 years. And I knew something else too. Whoever left this car here hadn't just left a body. They had set a stage, and I had just walked straight into it. I pressed the badge against my chest as if that piece of metal could give me courage. The flashlight trembled slightly in my hand, not out of fear of what was there, but from the surge of adrenaline that always comes. Before discovery, that sense that every detail around you might be the last thing you see before everything changes. I took a deep breath, shut the cruiser door, and walked back to the sedan. The silence of the highway roared inside my head, and every crunch of grass beneath my boots felt like it announced me to whoever had left that car here. My eyes swept the tree line. No movement, no shadows beyond the branches swaying in the wind, and still, the certainty burned in me. I was being watched. Not from miles away, but close. Someone holding their breath, waiting. I glanced down at the dirt. Tire tracks, fresh. Another vehicle had been here, maybe only hours earlier. It hadn't been chance. I drew my weapon, flicked the safety, and kept the flashlight low to the ground. Every step toward the trunk felt like walking across thin ice. The doors were locked, untouched. Who leaves a sealed car on the side of nowhere knowing the police will come? A trap or a message? I tested the drivers. Handle, locked. Rear door, locked. I crouched by the car and the smell hit me harder now. Not just abandonment, rot, flesh. That sweet, sick odor you never forget after your first crime scene. My body told me what was waiting before my mind could resist it. A crack behind me spun me around, gun raised. Just a branch snapping in the wind, nothing. And yet the sensation of being hunted only grew stronger. This wasn't random. This was deliberate. Someone had picked the place, the time, the details. I wasn't uncovering a crime, I was playing my part in a script. Back at the trunk, I slid the edge of my brake key into the latch. One sharp twist. A snap echoed into the night, loud as a gunshot. My pulse spiked. It felt like I had triggered an alarm only one person needed to hear, the one who'd set the trap. The lid cracked open, and the stench poured out, thick enough to choke. My stomach lurched, bile creeping up my throat, but my hand stayed firm. I raised the lid higher, gun ready. Inside, black plastic reflected the flashlight's beam like a pool of oil. I already knew what lay beneath, but still clung to that half-second where ignorance was safer than truth. Then I saw it, the duct tape sealing the bag, marked with a symbol scratched in ink, a circle split by a single line. I froze. That mark had haunted old evidence, surfaced in dead-end leads I chased years ago, always mocking me, always slipping away. Now it was here, staring back from the plastic wrapped around. Whatever was inside. The night seemed to stop. My breath thundered in my ears. This wasn't routine. This wasn't discovery. This was intrusion into something larger, something that had been waiting for me all along. And I realized as my finger tightened on the flashlight that I wasn't leading the investigation anymore. I was inside someone else's design. Still, I pushed forward, because retreat wasn't possible now, because 10 years of obsession demanded it, because the truth, however ugly, was only inches away. The black plastic split open like a wound, exposing the rigid outline of bones wrapped in silence. My flashlight slid over the remains, and every inch of illumination cut deeper into my memory. It was as if time itself had stopped inside that trunk, preserving not just decay, but the story I'd spent a decade trying to bury. For a moment, I didn't see human remains. I saw absence, finally given shape. The shadow that stalked me for 10 years now had a body, and then my eyes, locked on the detail that made my heart stumble. Dangling from the wrist bone, still clinging to a corroded chain, was a pendant of St. Michael. Worn, scratched, but unmistakable. I had given Nathan that pendant myself, one night after a raid that almost killed us both. I joked he needed extra protection, since my paranoia wasn't enough for the two of us. He'd laughed, promised he'd never take it off, and there it was. 10 years later, promise kept in the cruelest way. My legs felt like anchors, dragging me down. My lungs burned, and I leaned against the car, gun still in hand, though useless now. There he was, the partner I'd sworn to find, reduced to silence and bones. The truth I'd been denied by sterile reports and closed files was staring back at me. No longer a theory, no longer a memory, it was real. But Nathan's body wasn't the only message. Buried near the back, half covered by an old newspaper, was a brown envelope. My name scrawled across it in handwriting that was neat, deliberate, almost elegant. My pulse hammered as I picked it up, my hands trembling in a way they hadn't since my first case. I opened it slowly. Inside was a single Polaroid. The same sedan I stood over now, parked in the exact same spot, but taken earlier that very day, under daylight. And in the photo's edge, stretching long across the asphalt, was a shadow, a figure standing behind me. On the back, in thick black ink, a single line. You were too late again. The words cut deeper than any blade. Not just a reminder of the night I lost Nathan 10 years ago, but proof that someone had been watching me ever since. Someone who knew about the vow I carried, who'd tracked my obsession, who'd studied my every step. And now, they'd led me here, like a puppet being yanked on strings I hadn't realized were there. But there was more. Inside the envelope, next to the photo, lay a single bullet, polished, untouched, and engraved into the casing, the same symbol I'd seen on the duct tape. Sealing the bag, a circle split by a single line. The world seemed to tilt. My breath caught, my body rejecting the truth that my mind couldn't deny. This wasn't coincidence. Nathan wasn't just another unsolved victim. His death had been part of a design, a game, one where my role had already been decided long before I even stepped onto this highway. And the real shock wasn't the body in the trunk. It was realizing I'd never been the hunter in this story. I'd been the prey all along, and only now was the predator letting me see it. The trunk gaped open, like it wanted to swallow me whole, the past dragging me inside with claws I could no longer resist. Nathan's remains weren't just evidence. They were a mirror, reflecting everything I had become in the years since he vanished. A man eaten alive by guilt, defined not by victories but by scars. For 10 years I told myself I was searching for closure, for justice, but standing there I realized the truth. If this was closure, then it was. Emptier than the silence of that roadside. I thought about the promise I had made to his parents, about the countless nights I repeated it in my head like a prayer. I'll find him, no matter what it takes. And now, here he was, found, but not saved. Never saved. Finding him didn't erase the failure. It only underlined it. I had arrived too late once, and the note in that envelope mocked me with the certainty that I'd arrived too late again. The words looped through me, hammering. You were too late again. They weren't just an observation. They were an indictment, a curse, proof that someone knew me so well they could carve straight into the rawest part of my soul. They knew my failure wasn't just professional, it was personal. They knew I'd never forgiven myself. And now, they had turned that guilt into a weapon sharper than any blade. Rage clawed at me, but beneath it was something worse, doubt. What if the last decade of investigation hadn't been me chasing the truth, but me dancing on strings pulled by someone else? Every lead that went cold, every clue that dissolved into nothing. What if all of it had been orchestrated? Had I ever really been in control? Or had I always been walking a path designed for me, meant to lead me right here, right now? I looked down at the pendant still hanging from his wrist and remembered Nathan's laugh, the way he teased me for carrying the world on my shoulders. "You'll burn yourself out, partner," he used to say. He wasn't wrong. I hadn't, just burned out. I'd let the flames consume everything human left in me. No wife, no children, no life outside of this obsession. Just a bottle at night and case files that never gave answers. And here was the proof of it. I hadn't protected him. I hadn't kept my word. My entire identity had become the sum of my failures. But then the darker thought hit, one that chilled me deeper than the stench of death. What if Nathan hadn't just been a victim? What if he'd been chosen, a pawn in some game, designed not to destroy him, but to destroy me? His death had chained me for 10 years, kept me chasing shadows until I barely recognized myself. Maybe that was the point. Maybe that was always the point. My hand closed around the pendant, cold against my palm. For years it had symbolized guilt, but now it felt like something else. Mockery, as if the universe itself was laughing at me, daring me to keep carrying this weight until it crushed me. I wanted to believe in justice, in the thin blue line, in the idea that the badge meant something. But staring at the bones of my partner, I saw justice for what it really was. A fragile word, powerless against people who knew how to twist pain into control. And the ugliest truth of all clawed its way into my chest. Did I even want to find them? Because if I did, I'd have to face the possibility that I wasn't just too late. I was always meant to be late. That the only reason I was still alive was because they allowed it, because they wanted me to suffer longer. The thought made me sick, made me furious, made me terrified. But even through the storm of rage and fear, one certainty remained. I couldn't turn back. I couldn't unsee the body, unfeel the years of failure, unhear the taunt carved into that note. I was already inside their game, and if I didn't play it to the end, then everything Nathan lived for, everything I had sacrificed, would mean nothing. So I stood there torn open, every demon I'd carried now screaming louder than ever. Not a cop, not a hero, just a broken man staring into the abyss, knowing the abyss was staring back, smiling. The hand clutching the pendant trembled, not from fear of what was in front of me, but from knowing that the choice I was about to make would define everything. My career, my sanity, maybe even my life. The radio back in the cruiser barked at me in my head. Protocols, procedures, the safe way forward. Secure the scene. Call forensics, wait for backup. But another voice, older and sharper, rose above the noise. The voice of a promise I had made in front of a grieving family. The voice that had chained me to this hunt for 10 long years. I looked around, the tire tracks leading into the trees, the photo in the envelope showing a shadow behind me, the weight of eyes I couldn't see but could feel. If I called this in the way I was supposed to, within minutes the place would be swarming with flashing lights, boots in the dirt, radio chatter filling the air. It would spook whoever had staged this. It would give them time to vanish, to erase any trail, to rewrite the scene before I had a chance to read it. Protocol was safe, yes, but protocol also meant predictability. And whoever was playing this game knew exactly how the playbook worked. I could almost hear Nathan's voice in my head, telling me not to do something reckless. But the truth was, reckless was the only option left. To get answers, I had to break out of the script they'd written for me. If they expected me to play the obedient cop, then I would do the opposite. Not out of rebellion, but out of necessity. Because if I stuck to the rules, I would lose the only chance I might ever have of touching the shadow behind all this. So I made my choice. I slipped the envelope into my jacket, tucked the pendant deep into an inner pocket. I didn't disturb the body any more than I already had, but I closed the trunk gently, almost reverently, as if sealing a coffin. I dragged some branches across. The car, scattering leaves, disguising the scene the way a hunter hides a snare. It wasn't about hiding the evidence from my colleagues. It was about buying time, minutes, maybe hours, to trace the footprints of whoever had left this here. I holstered my gun, flicked off the safety, and followed the faint tracks leading off the shoulder. My boots pressed into damp earth, the flashlight beam cutting low across the ground. The woods swallowed me whole, every shadow alive with the possibility of being the one I was hunting. My badge weighed heavier than ever against my chest, but for once it didn't feel like authority. It felt like a burden. The badge stood for order, for the system. But I wasn't serving the system anymore. I was serving a vow. The decision was reckless. It was dangerous. It would stain my record, maybe end my career. But at that moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was that Nathan's killer, or the puppeteer pulling these strings, was close. Closer than they had ever been. And I couldn't hand that over to bureaucracy. Not now. I thought about the note again. You were too late again. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was always a step behind. But this time I wasn't waiting for permission. This time I wasn't giving them the ending they expected. I adjusted the flashlight, steadied my breath, and pushed deeper into the dark. From here on out, there was no turning back. Whatever was waiting for me, I'd meet it head on, even if it meant crossing the line between law and obsession for good. I followed the tire tracks along the edge of the woods, my pulse pounding so hard it felt like I could hear my own blood. Every step was a gamble. Maybe I'd stumble onto the one who staged this grotesque show. Maybe I'd catch a fresh trail that would finally give me answers. Or maybe I'd walk straight into a trap. By the time I circled back to the car, too much time had passed. The radio in the cruiser was alive with chatter, and within minutes, the scene was no longer mine. It was theirs. Procedures, protocols, voices cutting through the night, headlights slicing the darkness into pieces. My absence hadn't gone unnoticed. Sergeant Miller arrived first with the forensic team, his eyes landing on me before anything else. Relief flickered there, but it was buried under something harsher, disappointment. "Where the hell were you?" he asked, his tone clipped, not quite concealing the worry beneath. I told him the truth, that I'd followed tracks into the trees. He looked from me to the open trunk, then to the envelope I hadn't managed to hide. His jaw tightened. He didn't have to say it. I'd crossed a line. The scene lit up like a stage. Forensic techs in gloves moved around the car, snapping photos, measuring, bagging every detail. Their lenses flashed cold and clinical, stripping the moment of all humanity. I tried to explain. The photo, the symbol, the note. But the words came out sterile, hollow, nothing like the storm tearing me apart inside. Then Captain Donovan showed up, notebook in hand, expression carved from stone. He didn't waste time. "Who authorized you to leave the scene?" The question hit harder than any punch. I told him exactly why I did it. He stared at me like a man measuring whether I was still useful or already a liability. Consequences came fast. Chain of custody compromised. Scene manipulation. My attempt to disguise the trunk with branches was logged as contamination. The perimeters I had crossed out of instinct now became bullet points in disciplinary reports. The forensics team scribbled notes with clinical detachment, marking me not just as a cop on the case, but as a factor that had to be controlled. I knew the system. Explanations rarely saved you when policy had been broken. And then the news broke. Some local reporter had already caught wind of the discovery. He tried to push past the tape, camera in hand, asking why it took 10 years to find Detective Nathan Cole and why his own partner had been first on the scene. Before I could even catch my breath, Nathan's family was notified. His mother arrived, her cries carving through me like glass. She clutched my old promise like a lifeline. "I'll bring him home." Yes, I had brought him home, but too late. Always too late. Inside the department, the machine kicked in. Internal Affairs opened a review of my conduct. I was handed a temporary removal from active investigation, pending evaluation. It was protocol, but it felt like exile. Watching others step into the case was worse than any reprimand. They didn't know the shadows I knew, the false leads, the long nights I'd bled into this hunt. To them, it was just another file. To me, it was everything. That night, sitting alone in the interrogation room the brass used for their own, the weight of it all pressed down, the judgment of my peers, the raw grief of Nathan's family, the very real possibility that my career was slipping away. But buried beneath the shame was something sharper, a flicker of opportunity. Whoever left that note had wanted me rattled, predictable, but my decision to chase the tracks, reckless as it was, had proven something. The predator was still close. So yes, the immediate consequences were brutal. My name tied to procedural failures, my authority stripped, my reputation questioned. But as the flashing lights faded and the road fell quiet again, I knew this was only the beginning. The price would be high, maybe my badge, maybe my future. But the alternative? Living as the man who never dared to push further, who let the truth slip away again. That wasn't an option. Nathan's body lay in the morgue, the case stamped as reopened. The department thought that was the end of it. I knew better. This wasn't the end. It was the first move, and I was already paying for it. I was summoned to the interrogation room inside my own precinct, but not as an investigator. This time, I was the one under the light. The table was cold, the single lamp above me humming faintly. The kind of setup designed to remind you that you're on the wrong side of the game. Captain Donovan entered first, with Sergeant Miller at his side. But it wasn't their presence that shifted the air in that room. It was the man who walked in after them. Robert Hayes, mid-50s, tired face, eyes that carried the weight of someone who'd seen too much. I knew his name. Everyone did. FBI. He'd hovered around my old reports years ago, always at a distance, never dirtying. His shoes in the mud where we worked. Now here he was, sitting across from me, a worn leather folder in his hand, looking at me not with suspicion, but with recognition. He laid out photographs on the table one after another, the same symbol I'd seen on the duct tape sealing Nathan's remains, a circle slashed by a single line. It appeared in graffiti scrawled on alley walls in New Orleans, on the side of a warehouse in Detroit, even in seized documents tied to gun running in Arizona. My throat tightened. This wasn't a random mark. It was a calling card. "You think you've been chasing one killer for 10 years, Hayes said, his voice deep, steady, filling the room. "But the truth is, he's been leading you. That symbol belongs to something larger. We call them the line. They don't just kill. They turn grief into theater. They manipulate, control, and feed off the aftermath. What you found in that trunk wasn't closure. It was an invitation." The words hit me like body blows. Part of me wanted to deny it, cling to the idea that this was still just personal, that Nathan's death was one man's crime, and I could solve it alone. But another part of me, the part that had felt the weight of unseen eyes for years, Knew Hayes was right. The dead ends, the false leads, the constant sense of being one step behind, none of it was chance. It had been orchestrated. I wasn't the hunter. I was the mark. Why now? I asked, my voice rough. Why put his body in front of me after all this time? Why drag me back in? Hayes leaned forward, eyes locked on mine. Because you never gave up. And for them, that's useful. You're the string that keeps the game alive. They want you to see, to hurt, to move exactly where they need you. You're not outside their story, detective. You're the character they wrote. His words tore through me, because deep down I had always suspected it. And yet hearing it said out loud turned everything I thought I knew into ashes. I'd been living a script, one written in blood and guilt. Then Hayes revealed something that froze me in place. He pulled another envelope from his jacket, slid a note across the table. The same handwriting, the same words. You were too late again, but this one wasn't mine. It had been collected months earlier, in Texas, from another crime scene. Same phrasing, same signature. My obsession wasn't unique. My pain wasn't singular. The floor dropped out from under me. For 10 years, I had carried the weight as if it were mine, alone. Now I saw it for what it was, a pattern, a design. Nathan wasn't the first. I wasn't the only one. Hayes stood, gathering the photos, but before leaving, he bent close, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. You might lose your badge for this, maybe even more. But if you choose to keep going, you'll learn something. What began with Nathan didn't end with him. The line doesn't make mistakes. They wanted you to find that body. The only question is, what are you going to do about it? When the door shut behind him, I sat in the silence, heart pounding. I didn't have answers, but I had something far more dangerous, a new purpose. I wasn't just chasing Nathan's killer anymore. I was staring down an entire machine, and for the first time in years, I felt alive. When the door closed behind Hayes, a heavy silence wrapped around me. Not the empty silence of the highway, but the kind that settles inside you when the foundation of your life has just been ripped out. For the first time in 10 years, I stopped seeing myself only as a failed man chasing his partner's ghost. I saw the truth. I had been a pawn in something bigger, not in the heroic sense, but in the cruelest way possible. My grief had been turned into fuel for someone else's game. Learning that Nathan wasn't the only victim of that symbol cracked me open. For a decade, I believed my obsession made me weak, that my guilt was mine alone. But now I understood. There were others carrying the same burden, other families, other agents, all trapped by the same hand. It should have given me comfort. Instead, it sharpened my despair. If Nathan wasn't the first, then this wasn't a tragedy. It was a system. In the days that followed, sleep abandoned me. I sat in front of the bathroom mirror at night, staring at a face that barely felt like mine. The wrinkles weren't just time. They were carved by every failure, every corpse zipped into a bag while I stood powerless. But behind my bloodshot eyes, something new flickered. Not just rage, purpose. I realized I could shape my guilt into a weapon. Nathan once told me I carried the world on my shoulders like I'd been appointed its judge. He was right. But I'd confused punishment with responsibility. For years, I thought my failures disqualified me. Now I understood. My failures were the very reason I had to keep going. They were fire. They were fuel. The shift was slow, like dawn after a night that seemed endless. One small step at a time, I slipped Nathan's pendant into my pocket, not as a chain of guilt, but as a symbol of resolve. I reopened old case files, not to torture myself, but to hunt for patterns I had been too blinded to see. I replayed the sound of his mother's grief, not as accusation, but as motivation. Every piece of pain became a tool in my hands. I accepted something I had resisted my whole career. I couldn't save everyone. I never could. But I could stop those who used tragedy as theater. The line wasn't invincible. They were human. Humans leave, traces, repeat habits, make mistakes. If I could see past their performance, I could find the seams. I also understood I couldn't walk this road alone anymore. For 10 years, I isolated myself, convinced no one would understand. But Hayes showed me there were others who had seen the same mark, read the same note, bled from the same wound. If I wanted to bring this to an end, I had to stop being just the lone cop chasing a ghost. I had to be part of something larger. One night, staring at my reflection, I whispered words that felt like a vow. They won't write my ending. Not this time. It was simple, but it carried weight. I was no longer just a detective haunted by failure. I was a man prepared to turn that failure into purpose, to wield it against those who thought they owned my story. That was the real transformation, accepting that the wound wouldn't heal, but that it didn't have to. Scars can guide as much as they haunt. The emptiness doesn't vanish, but it can be filled with resolve. Nathan would never come back, but his memory would no longer chain me down. It would hold me steady when the darkness tried to pull me under again. And for the first time in years, I felt something close to peace. Not because the fight was over, but because I had finally chosen my side. I would no longer be the ghost chasing shadows. I would be the shadow hunting them. Officially, the case was closed in a stack of paperwork, just like so many others I'd seen buried before. The files said the body recovered was Detective Nathan Cole, missing for 10 years, identified through DNA and a corroded pendant. Cause of death, undetermined, due to advanced decomposition. Cold words on paper, sterile, 2 pages of nothing. But I knew, everyone knew, that wasn't closure. It was a placeholder, a bureaucratic full stop on a story that refused to end. The trunk was sealed, the car towed, the yellow tape pulled down after days of forensic work. The highway went quiet again, leaving nothing but pressed weeds and faint tire scars washed away by rain. To the public, the Cole case was finally concluded. But I couldn't accept that. The envelope with my name, the Polaroid taken hours before, the message carved into my bones, none of that fit the word conclusion. This wasn't the end. It was a spark. Inside the department, the closure came wrapped in protocol. Internal Affairs opened a review. Reports were written. Disciplinary recommendations drafted. Officially, I had compromised the scene by acting alone, but mitigating emotional circumstances were noted. In the end, I was hit with a formal reprimand and urged to take medical leave. Paper shields. Empty words trying to domesticate something feral. But I refused the leave. I couldn't step away, and Hayes knew it. He came back to me in secret. No witnesses, carrying the truth the files would never show. He slid a dossier across the table, dozens of pages, each stamped with the same symbol, the circle with the single line. Graffiti, notes, evidence tags from different states. And again, the same haunting phrase, "You were too late again." The Bureau saw it as a pattern of behavior. I saw it for what it was, a provocation, personal and precise, a hand pulling me deeper into their game. So the real conclusion of that night wasn't written in reports or sealed in evidence bags. It was the decision I made when I walked out of that room. Nathan's body had been found, but his story was not over, and I wouldn't let it be reduced to a statistic. If the system wanted to file it away, then I would carry it in me, alive and unfinished. Days later, I returned to the roadside where the sedan had been found, alone. No cruisers, no flashing lights, no gloves snapping in the dark. Just the wind, the sound of insects, the memory of a trunk that had changed everything. I stood there, staring at the emptiness where the car once sat, and felt it as clear as anything. This wasn't where a 10-year hunt ended. It was where a new one began. The conclusion of the occurrence, then, wasn't a neat ending or justice served. It was my transformation into something else. No longer just a cop with a partner's ghost on his back. Now I was at war, with shadows, with a network that thrived on pain, with the idea that I had ever been in control. And I understood at last. I wasn't broken beyond use. I was sharpened. As I left that place, I touched the pendant in my pocket. Nathan's last trace. It no longer burned like guilt. It anchored me, and I whispered into the night, to him, to myself, to the enemy still watching, "This isn't over, not by a long shot. That was the true conclusion. Not peace, not closure, but fire. The fire of a man who had nothing left to lose, and finally knew what to do with that. The days that followed felt unlike anything I'd known in the last decade. The routine of the precinct went on. Radio chatter, case files piling up, the endless march of other people's tragedies. But inside me, something had shifted for good. Nathan finally received a proper burial, with folded flags, polished speeches, and tears that burned like salt. I stood there in front of the casket, feeling the weight of my promise pressed against my chest one last time. But what I felt wasn't relief. It wasn't closure. It was the bitter truth that some wounds never heal. They just harden into scars that remind you who you are and why you keep fighting. That day, I learned that the life of a cop isn't measured in victories. It's measured in choices. Some are heroic, some are ugly, most will never make headlines. For years, I told myself I had failed Nathan, that I wasn't fast enough, strong enough, good enough. But failure, I realized, is part of being human. And accepting it doesn't make you weaker. It makes you sharper. It means you can take even your deepest losses and turn them into weapons against the dark. The mark of the line still follows me. I know I'll see it again, in another city, on another wall, beside another body. But the difference now is that I don't carry it alone. I know there are others, agents, families, victims, who've been caught in the same game. And the truth I hold on to is this: we're not defined by how many times we've been too late. We're defined by whether we keep moving forward anyway. The real lesson came quietly, late at night, when I stared at my reflection and didn't see a broken man anymore. I saw someone who had been through fire and chose to stay standing. That's the essence of the badge, I think. Not saving everyone, not winning every fight, but refusing to let the weight crush you, refusing to quit, even when the odds laugh in your face. Nathan's pendant rests in my pocket still, but now it doesn't burn like guilt. It steadies me, reminds me. It says that pain can be compass, not just burden. That grief can be anchor, not just chain. The line might still be out there writing their scripts, trying to decide who lives and who dies, but they don't get to write mine. Not anymore. And if you've listened to my story this far, then take this with you. Never let someone else write your ending. Never hand your scars to the wrong hands. Use them. Turn them into your map, your weapon, your strength. Because in the end, it isn't the shadows that define us. It's how we choose to walk through them. So here's my final request. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment telling me which part struck you hardest. Because stories like this only matter when they're shared, when the silence is broken, when the dark is dragged into the light. Together, we make sure no shadow lasts forever.